Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh, and good morning to everyone. Okay, how are you today? I hope everyone is fine and take care of yourself and enjoy learning online. Okay, so today we look at the chapter 6 in our syllabus, which is tertiary sector, public and private sector. All right, so under this chapter, you will able to learn about this learning outcome, which is to explain the function of the public sector in the Malaysian economy, to discuss the needs for fiscal policies in the economy, and also to identify the components of the federal government budget, discuss the budget deficit and the national debt, and also discuss ways to improve the productivity of the public sector. And now we look at the introduction of this chapter. So the tertiary sector is a segment of the economy that provides services to its consumers, and it includes a wide range of businesses such as banking and financial institutions, insurance agencies, schools, healthcare providers, restaurant, retail, and also the wholesale trade. And we also emphasize on the transportation, communication, and tourism. And this tertiary sector is also known as the service sector. Under this introduction, the role of the government has been significant in driving the growth of the Malaysian economy. And with the fluctuation in the world economy, the government has taken the necessary measure to reduce the budget deficit and balance of payment deficit. And this chapter also focuses on the role of the government in the economic system. Basically, the tourism sector, also known as the tertiary sector, and we'll also discuss given its significance in contribution to the Malaysian economy after the manufacturing sector. So now, we take a look at this structure of tertiary sector. You can see, isn't it? The services falls under intermediate and also finals. Under intermediate, it divided into two, which is transportation, storage, and communication. And the second one is the finance, insurance, real estate, and also business services. Under final, it divides into one category only, which is electricity, gas, water, hotel, restaurant, utilities, and also government services.
So now class, let's take a look at the public sector. So public sector is actually refers to the economy concerned with providing various government services. So the composition of the government services varies by country. However, in most countries, the public sector provides services such as military, police, public education, healthcare, and infrastructure, such as public roads, bridges, tunnels, water supply, electricity, telecommunications, and so forth. So from the slide here, we can see that public sector is actually owned by federal or state government, and it participates in industrialization, agriculture, finance, and trade. So to carry out programs and activities to enhance the integrity of civil servants on the federal state levels, this creating an effective civil service delivery system in the country. What are the purpose of the public sector? One of the purposes are to provide incentives in balanced development, and then secondly is to accelerate higher income to the country, and thirdly is to overcome socio-economic problems. There are actually a few main economic functions of the public sector, such as regulatory function, allocative function, distributive function, stabilization function, and public goods provider, which we will take a look into in the next slide. So now let's take a look into a further detail on what are the functions of the public sector. Yeah. So some of the functions here is to carry out training and education programs on the integrity of the civil service. And then the public sector also helps to organize conferences, seminars, and forums on integrity. And then from this sector, advisory services on integrity programs are provided. And another functions of public sector is to fulfill requests for briefings and lectures on integrity, as well as to collaborate with other agencies in implementing integrity program. And another thing is to gather opinions, to collect opinions from various sectors, and actually to conduct research in improving the integrity of the civil service. And another function for the public sector is actually to submit policy certifications to the authorities and stakeholders to conduct research and publish materials. So here, let's take a look at the government revenue. There are three types of government revenue here. First, from the non-tax revenue and borrowing, direct taxes and indirect taxes. So here class, the government revenue is actually defined as the money received by government and is an important tool of the fiscal policy of the government. So the federal government receives revenues from sources such as taxes levied on the incomes and wealth accumulation of individuals and corporations, as well as taxes on the goods and services produced and exports and imports. Revenue is also earned from non-taxable sources, such as incomes from government-owned corporations, the central bank's revenue, and capital receipts in the form of external loans and debts from international financial institutions. So the government uses revenue to better develop the country, such as to fix roads, to build schools, hospitals, and houses, and provide services for the people. So here class, this is what government does. They are collecting these revenues in order to help the people in our own country. So like we already mentioned just now, the three types of government revenues they are collected by indirect taxes. So when we're talking about indirect taxes, so tax revenue is divided into direct tax revenue and indirect tax revenue. So the burden of direct taxes falls on the taxpayer and cannot be shifted to someone else. This is what we call direct taxes. But when we are talking about indirect taxes, the burden of indirect taxes can actually be transferred to another person. For instance, if we learned in macroeconomics, what are indirect taxes? Indirect taxes is actually a transferable tax. For instance, in clothing, maybe they charge you in the items that you purchase. Usually the sales tax, the sales tax. So these are how the government can earn the taxes from the people, and it becomes the sources of the government revenue. And then when we look at the non-tax revenues and borrowing, what is this? This is actually the revenue from other sources besides taxes. And also these are revenue receipts which are not generated by taxing the public. So as we can look over here, please make it bigger. Okay. So if we look here, this is what we call the government revenue. So the revenue sources of government revenue comes from revenue, debt, issuing, and others. So from revenue, there consists of tax. Tax which includes direct taxes, corporate personal, petroleum taxes, and then there are indirect tax such as sales, services, import and export duties, and also non-tax revenue and borrowing, license and permit, services fees, petroleum royalties. So from here class, you can see tax revenue is classified into direct tax revenue and indirect tax revenue, as I've already mentioned in the previous slide. So this form of revenue is compulsory contribution imposed by the government on the individuals and private organizations. So these taxes are imposed on income and are the most important sources of government revenue. So the burden of direct taxes cannot be shifted to another party. So direct tax revenue includes revenue from income tax and supplementary income tax, such as individual, company, petroleum, withholding, and cooperatives. And then secondly is estate duty. And then the third one, stamp duty, petroleum income tax, real property gain tax, and then Labuan offshore business activity tax, as well as miscellaneous direct taxes. And then we have this indirect tax revenue, like what I've mentioned before. These are taxes that impose on goods and services. So the burden of these taxes can actually be shifted to another party. Most developing countries depend on indirect taxes for revenue, such as goods and services tax, export duty, import duty, excise duty, levy, and miscellaneous indirect taxes. And then we have these non-tax revenue. What are these? This is actually the revenue obtained by the government from other sources apart from taxes, okay? Like treasury bills, bonds, and loans. And then we have the service fees, sales of goods, fines, and forfeitures. And then we also have these petroleum and gas royalties. So now we will take a look at another source of government revenue would be debt, yeah? The national government debt is defined as the country's borrowings, both internally and externally. Therefore, national debts comprise domestic debt and external debt. So the major sources of domestic borrowings come from the sale of treasury bills by commercial banks, Bank Negara Malaysia, and discount companies, investment certificates, government securities by the Employees Provident Fund, which is EPF, or also known as KWSP, yeah? Commercial banks, Bank Simpanan Nasional, and insurance companies, and other investment certificates. More than 80% of Malaysia's national debt is generated internally and the rest from external sources. The major sources of external debts come from loans borrowed from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Asia Development Bank, and some developed countries, such as the United States and Japan. So most foreign loans are used to finance specific projects and the equity market. Okay? So the major sources of external debts come from loans borrowed from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Asia Development Bank, and some developed countries such as the United States and Japan. So most foreign loans are used to finance specific projects and the equity market. So here we can see debt consists of local and foreign, and in terms of the treasury bills government sector. Then they have these issuings like bonds and shares and others such as used government allocation, trade surplus, ads from other countries. So when we're talking about the government revenue, now we move on to the government expenditure. So what is government expenditure? So here there are three types, yeah. Government expenditure consists of operating expenditure and development expenditure. Okay, what is operating expenditure? Operating expenditure refers to the expenditure that is spent on various government departments to maintain their services for the public. So among the major subcategories in operating expenditures are emoluments, salaries of federal government employees and staff on statutory bodies, and then staff pensions and gratuities, grants and transfers to the state governments, debt and service charges, and then asset acquisitions, supplies and services, subsidies, scholarships and loans, maintenance and repair works, general administration and security. And what is development expenditure? Development expenditure refers to government expenditure that is related to projects which boost economic growth. Here, boost economic growth means generate income, yeah, or strengthen the productive capacity of the economy. So among the major subcategories in development expenditure are economic services in sectors such as agriculture, industry and rural development, education, health and housing, defense and internal security, public utilities, and then contingency reserves. So now let's take a look at the fiscal policy, okay? What is fiscal policy? fiscal policy is the use of government expenditure and taxes to promote particular macroeconomic goals such as full employment, stable prices, and economic growth. And then it is also refers to expansionary fiscal policy that increase real output, employment, and income in order to move the economy out of recession. Besides that, the contractionary fiscal policy decrease real output, employment, and income in order to combat problem of inflation. There are types of budget policy here, yeah. The first is the balanced budget that occurs when government expenditure is equal to the government revenue. The second one is the surplus budget, where total revenue is more than total expenditure. And the third one would be the deficit budget, where total revenue is less than total expenditure. So a federal government budget is actually an itemized estimated financial statement presenting the government's proposed revenues and spending for a financial year. A national budget records the sources of revenue received by the government and the payments or operating expenditure made by the government for the coming fiscal year. For the national budget, one can tell where the government's money comes from, the revenue, and where it goes to, the expenditure. So in Malaysia, for instance, the sources of government revenue come from income taxes, other direct taxes, non-tax revenue, indirect taxes, export duties, borrowings, and the use of government assets. So government expenditure, on the other hand, can actually be classified into two types. First is the development expenditure and operating expenditure, as what I've already mentioned in the past slides. Yeah. So now, when we're talking about the budget policy, there are three types, okay, as you can see in the slide. So what is actually the balanced budget? Yeah? Balanced budget policy refers to a budget in which government's expenditure equals its government revenue. Okay, and also there are budget deficits and budget surplus. So in budget surplus, a decrease in government spending will directly decrease the aggregate demand, while an increase in tax level will slow down economic growth as consumers will have less money to consume and invest. Now that we have learned about the government budget policy, the government's revenue, let's move on to the privatization policy. So what is privatization policy? It's actually the transfer of the public sector activities and functions to the private sector. Means to say from public, it shifted to the private. And then the transfer involves three essential organizations, which in related component, which are management responsibility, assets, and personnel. And then the privatization policy was announced as a national policy by the government in the 1983. So what are the objectives of privatization policy? The objective is to relieve the government's financial burden. Yeah, it means its purpose is actually to help government reduce its financial burden, and then it actually to improve work efficiency and productivity, because in private, basically when we are talking about private, we know that their efficiency is much higher, yeah, and then to facilitate economic growth, to reduce the size of presence of the public sector in the company, and to meet the new economic policy. So one thing that I want to touch about the improving work efficiency and productivity, because in private, people need to compete to each other. That is why in this private sector, we need to work more efficiently and productive, yeah, to increase our productivity to stay in the business. So that is why this is the purpose why privatization policy exists. And then what are the benefits of privatization? It has a lot of benefit actually. Now let's take a look closer. The benefits of privatization is actually to increase in efficiency and productivity, like I've mentioned earlier, because in private sector, there are a lot of competitions among groups of peoples, among companies, yeah, in order to survive. So the second one is to increase in economic growth. With privatization, it is hoped that economic growth could accelerate, yeah, and then it benefits the public, such as giving more employment to the public, yeah. When there are more private sector, there are more employment, and then manpower development. This manpower development is in terms of the people, yeah. They are being employed, they are being skilled because they need to compete with each other, so they have to polish their own skills and develop themselves to become a skillful manpower. And then reduction in the government's administrative burden. Besides that, privatization also helps to increase technology transfer, because in this private sector there will be a lot of companies that deals with the foreign sector. So from here, they learn a lot of new technologies from other countries, and hence this knowledge that they have could be transferred among the people in Malaysia. And then privatization also benefit in terms of market capitalization, and it also increased Bumiputra participation in the corporate sector. So here Bumiputra will not only become in the primary sector, but they are also involved in the tertiary sector. So now, what are the methods of privatization? The first would be the sales of equity, that involves the transfer of three organizations such as components, namely management responsibility, assets and personnel. For example, Proton and Telecom Malaysia. And then second is the sales of asset, which involves the transfer of one, two or even three components in sales of equity. And then we have lease of assets. This is also one of the methods of privatization, by leasing of assets, yeah. It involves transfer of the right to use assets for a specified period of time and amount of payment. For example here, KTMB and Malaysian Airport. Another method of privatization would be management buyout, MBO. Not MBO cinema. Yeah? This is actually the management buyout, which involves top managerial personnel of a company taking over a company that they initially employed in. And then we have this build operated transfer, BOT. In a BOT, the the public sector grantor grants to a private company the right to develop and operate a facility or system for a certain period, the concession period, in what would traditionally be a public sector project plus expressway, KLIA Express and KLIA Transit. And then last but not least, one of the methods of privatization includes build-operate. It's actually similar to build-operated transfer, BOT, but it does not involve the transfer of facility to the government. For example, PLUS. So in the next slide, we are going to take a look at the contributions of tourism to economic growth. So the government has actively pushed to increase tourism Malaysia, yeah, to diversify the economy and make it less dependent on exports. Consequently, tourism has become Malaysia's third largest source of foreign exchange income and accounted for about 7% of the GDP as of 2005. So, what are the contributions of tourism to the economic growth? First would be tourist receipts and contribution to GDP. And then it creates employment through retail, transportation. Because when there are tourism, yeah, there will be a lot of shopping malls built in order to attract foreign tourists to come to Malaysia. So here it also attract this foreign direct investment to invest in Malaysia, open up a lot of stores, a lot of shopping malls. So from these shopping malls, transportation, like when they are building more of the public transport, they are actually creating more employment for the people, okay, so that the locals could have job. This is one of the way tourism helps the economy. And then tourism also helps to stimulate the infrastructure investment. For example, better roads. Of course, if you want to have a better to become a better tourist spot, you need to develop the infrastructure first. Better roads, better transportation, yeah, water supplies, yeah, better electricity. So these are the some of the tourism's contribution to the economic growth. And then growth in other related activities, for example, shopping center accommodation. This one is just almost the same as the creation of employment. When there are tourism activities, of course, in order to attract people, we need to have better accommodation as well. So that's why when you look at Malaysia, they have a lot of big buildings. Now they have a lot of hotels. It's like a mushroom, a branch of mushroom, uh, like hotels everywhere. Not only the 3-star, 2-star, but also the 5 stars. Yeah, this is to attract more tourists to come and enjoy their visiting to our country. Not only for foreigners, but also for our own locals, so that we can travel within our own country. And then tourism also helps in local economies, for example, entertainment and vendors. So there are a few types of tourism here that we are going to talk about in this chapter. The first would be the educational tourism. Okay, so for this educational tourism, hospitality and tourism education is one of the fastest growing sectors of the post-secondary education system. Malaysia has actually established various educational facilities and infrastructure to position itself as a center for educational excellence in the Asia-Pacific region. So the number of foreign students in Malaysia is expected to reach 200,000 people by 2020. Some factors that make Malaysia a conducive environment for learning are its political stability, low exchange rates, safe environment, technological progress, and research opportunities. Thus, foreign students, especially those from India, China, and Islamic countries, are attracted to further their studies in Malaysia's public and private institutions of higher learning. And then we have this ecotourism. Seven Wonders of Malaysian, ecotourism, Mulu Caves, National Park Sarawak, Penang National Park. These are the 7 wonders of Malaysian ecotourism. Yeah. And then we have these agrotourism. Among the agrotourism activities that are well received are visits to orchards and animal farms, such as research centers and also homestays. Yeah. In Malaysia, agrotourism was actually introduced in 1991. So this is to improve the country's account balance. It was included in the 6th Malaysian Plan 1991 to 1995. It offers tourists an assortment of activities relating to the agriculture sector, as Malaysia is rich in agricultural resources. So agrotourism activities include visits to orchards and animal farms, research centers, and then homestays, pick your own produce, fishing, and farm stays. Okay. So the main agency that are responsible for developing agrotourism is the Ministry of Agriculture and Agro-Based Industry, MOA. Now, another types of tourism is actually the sports tourism. What is actually the sport tourism? For example, Malaysian Grand Prix, Le Tour de Langkawi, and Monsoon Cup. So these are some of the types of tourisms that we have in Malaysia. Other than that, we also have these health tourism, yeah, where we have very good facilities in healthcare. So that's why Malaysia is one of the destinations chosen for people outside Malaysia to have their health checks, yeah, because of the accommodation, the facilities, one of the best healthcare system in the world. Previously, there are also like some people from Indonesia, they always come to Sarawak. I mean, in Kuching, for example, the people from Pontianak there, they always come to Borneo Medical Center to get checkups because according to them, they have a good facility there. They have a very good hospitality as well. So that is why people outside Malaysia sometimes they prefer to go to Malaysia to get their health check. So that's why this is also we can also say that Malaysia is having a very good hospital tourism. I mean healthcare tourism. So in the previous slides, we already discussed about what are the contributions of tourism in the Malaysian economic sector, and then we also discussed what are the types of tourism in Malaysia. And now let's take a look what are the strategies that we adopt to promote the tourism sector. So here, these are some of the strategies that we do to promote the tourism sector. The first would be Visit Malaysia Yearly campaign, which was started in 1990, became the starting point for the expansion of the country's tourism industry. And then we have this encouragement for private investment in the tourism industry. For example, Malaysian government had prepared incentives in the form of financial funding. And then we have this hosting of international anchor events, which can attract foreign visitors either as delegations, participants, supporters, teams, or audiences, and bring in high-spending business travelers. And then another strategies in promoting the tourism sector includes promoting Malaysia as a shopping destination. That is why we have a lot of shopping complexes these days, in order to attract the tourists to come to our country. Now that we are going to the last section of this chapter, let me explain to you some of the shortcomings and disadvantages of tourism in Malaysia. So tourism is becoming an increasingly important as a source of revenue of Malaysia. As such, the Malaysian government has pushed to strengthen the tourism industry in an effort to diversify the country's economy. However, there are some of the shortcomings on tourism in Malaysia. Okay, what are the shortcomings? I mean the disadvantages of the tourism in Malaysia. First would be the security threats and crimes. With increase of tourism, the security threats and crimes also increase. Yeah, and then we also have this complicated visa application process, and then not tourist friendly. Some tourists have reported that local travel agents are not as helpful. Yeah, so the Thai counterparts, as their Thai counterparts, yeah, people in Malaysia are generally more reserved. They are not as friendly as these people from the West. So sometimes the foreigners, they have this impression that Malaysians are not that friendly or not even that helpful. So besides, there is also a lack of information on public transportation. This one is quite true. Sometimes when we are going somewhere, one of the problems here in Malaysia is their lack of information. If you go to other countries, I mean the more developed countries, they will like every roads they have this information. But here, unfortunately, for some parts, not all parts, the information is quite limited. Then this actually not so friendly to those tourists who actually tries to find their roads. Yeah. So to sum up this chapter, tourism Malaysia has contributed significantly to the country's economy over the last 30 years. And in terms of the tertiary sector, which consists of public and private sector, have been given emphasis by the government due to its increasing role in generating Malaysian economic growth. And then the government has implemented various policies in ensuring macroeconomic stability through fiscal policy, budget policy, and privatization. Also, we can sum up that the tourism sector is a prominent contribution to Malaysia's GDP. although it also has the disadvantages in terms of like minor issues like not so tourist friendly, and then they have this environmental damage. Yeah, tourism also impacted in terms of environmental damages, because when there are a lot of people coming in, of course the environmental sometimes will be disrupted, also because we need to build a lot of new stuffs. Yeah, so we have come to the end of the chapter, and see you guys in the last chapter, which is next week. That is the chapter number 7. Yeah, bye bye.